My name is Amita Baviskar and I'm at the Institute of Economic Growth. I'm a sociologist and cultural anthropologist. I'm a sociologist and a cultural anthropologist by training, and most of my work has been on the cultural politics of people's struggles around natural resources, land, forests, water, and so on, and the ways in which their relationships with these resources are also the ways in which they think of themselves, the forms of political identity that they have. Much of my work was on the question of large dams in central India, looking at struggles around rivers which are sacred and around forests which people depend on for their livelihoods. And since then I've also gone on to work on urban environmental politics, looking at the ways in which cities are changing in terms of both their spaces, their landscape, as well as in terms of the kind of livelihoods they provide, especially for poor people. I think what's interesting and exciting about the politics of nature is the way in which it brings together a whole set of things which normally don't get treated or looked at in a cohesive way. Bring together questions of science, questions of politics, questions of culture, and all of these are issues which are alive and which are in fact being hotly contested and debated in India at the moment. And what one understands by the politics of nature really in fact depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to an upper class urban environmentalist, they'll have a very different vision of the politics of nature than a person who lives and depends on forests in, say, central India, or somebody who believes that a river is sacred. So the fact that there are so many competing definitions makes for a very exciting field of study, and a field of study that is also deeply relevant to people's lives and to changing the world and making it a better place. So I would think that this is a topic that must surely excite other people as well, and stimulate them in ways to think about their own contribution to society, but also changing the ways in which they understand the world. It's very interesting that when it comes to climate change, the Indian government has adopted a tone of the moral high ground, and argues that per capita consumption of, say, fossil fuels in India are very low, per capita emissions are very low, and therefore the Indian government represents India as a country which has to call the industrialized world into account, and which, like a lot of other low income countries like, say, China or Brazil and South Africa, can claim to speak for countries which have been sort of unfairly treated in the way in which the world is industrialized, and which therefore need to make an argument about their continued ability to and their continued right to global emissions, to contribute to global emissions in the future. What's very interesting about this position that the Indian government adopts internationally is that it actually leaves out the fact that most poor people in India have a lifestyle which is very different from that of the rich in India. And what needs to be discussed within climate change deliberations is this question of inequalities within the country. Because the rich in India, and there are 300 million of them, consume on levels which are on par with those people who consume in the West. So there needs to be a rethink in terms of the kind of industrial growth that the Indian government has embarked upon, which plans to actually add to the number of rich people and which will therefore add to emissions, and to think about the ways in which this is going to adversely affect poor people, the poor people on whose backs the government is taming a certain moral high ground in international negotiations. I think if there's any true inheritor of Gandhi's legacy in India today, it has to be the environmental movement. Because Gandhi's critique of industrialization, and this is, Gandhi said that heaven forbid that every country or India should industrialize like the United Kingdom. Because if the consumption of one tiny island has managed to result in devastation across the world, imagine if India were to consume on that scale. It would strip the world bare like locusts, he said. So this idea that there is something fundamentally wrong with a development model that is based on increased and intensified extraction of resources from nature is something that Gandhi brought out very clearly in his thinking and in also the way in which he lived his life. And it is something that is a major source of inspiration for environmental movements as well. Because in India, these environmental movements are not only critical of the kind of intensive consumption that happens abroad, especially in the West, they're also very critical of the way in which this consumption extracts a price from them and from their environments. So if you look right now at the kind of transformation that is happening in India with mining, with large dams, with large projects of different kinds which are taking over forests, coastal areas and so on, one can see that movements of resistance against these projects are very clearly drawing upon Gandhi's ideas of an alternative mode of development, which would be give first place to the poorest people of the country, and which would try and make sure the development first of all benefited them. And that kind of development must be something which has to be fairly low key and low in terms of its resource intensity. So there's a clear continuity between Gandhi's thought and environmental movements in India today. In some ways, if one stops to think about this issue of the environmentalism of the poor as an issue which is only in India and tries to think of other ways in which it exists, then one can find many other instances of people in places like Thailand, Indonesia, people in Brazil who have tried to save, say, the Amazonian rainforest because they tap rubber, or their indigenous communities whose survival culturally depends on the forest being the way it is. But also in industrialized nations like the United States, you have movements of poor people who are fighting against the location of, say, toxic or hazardous manufacturing industries or dumps in their neighborhoods. And it's been called the environmental justice movement, that everybody has a right to a clean as well as safe environment. But I think it's only in the context of the industrializing countries that these are questions which have been linked to the question of basic resources for subsistence. So if one thinks of the world in terms of a global north and a global south, then one realizes that the global south also exists in the heart of the affluent north, be it in North America or be it in Europe. I think from the very beginning, what has been a distinctive signature of environmentalism in India is the fact that it is inseparable from issues of social justice and equity. And if in the West, environmentalism came to be a concern after people had achieved a certain level of material comfort, so they began to care about having a certain quality of life, a nice environment to live in. In the Indian case, as the historian Ramachandra Guha has pointed out, throughout questions of environment have been raised by poor people who have been using them to talk about their access to the basic means of subsistence. So the aspect of green or ecological sustainability has been throughout combined with the idea of red issues or the issues of social justice and social equity. And if one looks at the big social movements that have happened in India, they have not been about clean air or about quality of life. They've by and large been of poor people struggling to hold on to the resources that they need for their survival. Be it the Chipko movement, which happened in the hills where people tried to make sure that there was no deforestation, because they needed the forest for their livelihood, or be it the movement against large dams, where again people made the point that these dams were going to submerge their cultural way of living, as well as the land and the forest that they needed in order to survive as a community. So this environmentalism of the poor is an important contribution and a distinctive contribution that India has made to global debates around environmental questions. Unlike other places where environmental questions are generally seen as issues which require scientific and technical information, and decisions are supposed to be made by people who are informed in this way. What is really distinctive about the Indian context is that a lot of the debates as well as struggles around the environment are seen as issues of social justice as well as cultural understandings of what the environment is all about. So science does play a role, but I think what makes it a very interesting field for research on the environment is the way in which these are also then treated as questions about political rights and democracy, as well as questions about different kinds of cultural understandings. So the research has to necessarily be interdisciplinary because it has to bring together issues of science, issues of management, along with questions of politics as well as sociology. The distinctive thing about Indian environmentalism is that a lot of people have been involved with struggles on the ground, and these are by and large very poor, illiterate people who are farmers or fisher people, people who depend on forests. And it's their struggles that have by and large inspired the research that happens on these questions in India. So if one looks at what has been the driving force behind research on environmental issues, a lot of it has to do with questions of social justice and questions of different cultural understandings that people have about the environment. What does the environment mean for different people? How do you actually try to make sure that you get a voice in terms of decisions being made around the environment? These are the kinds of questions which have become really prominent in the kind of environmental debates that have happened, as opposed to perhaps other places where environmental questions have been primarily questions about, say, scientific dispute or about technical managerial aspects of dealing with the environment.